Inna alhamdulillah, all praise is due to Allah. Nahmaduhu wa nasta'inu wa nastaghfiruh. We praise Him, we seek His assistance, and we seek His forgiveness. وَنَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنْ شُرُورِ أَنفُسِنَا وَمِنْ سَيِّئَاتِ أَعْمَالِنَا. We seek refuge in Allah from the evil within ourselves and of our deeds. وَأَشْهَدُ أَنْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَحْدَهُ لَا شَرِيكَ لَهُ. I testify that there is no deity except God, with whom there is no partner. وَأَشْهَدُ أَنَّ مُحَمَّدًا عَبْدُهُ وَرَسُولُهُ. And I testify that Muhammad is His messenger and servant. Sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa azwajihi wa barik wa sallimu tasliman kathiran kathira. May His peace and blessings be upon Him, His prophets, upon Him, His family, His companions, His wives, and indeed upon all of the believers until the day of judgment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ حَقَّ تُقَاتِهِ وَلَا تَمُوتُنَّ إِلَّا وَأَنْتُمْ مُسْلِمُونَ. Believers, heed God as He should be heeded and do not die except in Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ, O mankind, اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. Mankind, fear your Lord who created you from a single soul, and from that soul created its mate, and from the two of them made many men and women. Fear the one through whom you demand your mutual rights and the wombs that bore you. Indeed, God is watching over all that you do. Wabad. We begin in the name of Allah Azza wa Jal by asking Him to send peace and blessings upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. May His peace and blessings be upon him and his family. Brothers and sisters in Islam, I wanted to begin today's khutbah by recounting a very famous hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam that some of the scholars said was the very first khutbah that he gave in Medina. The very first khutbah after he was excommunicated from Mecca and he found himself in a new environment, in a new community. He gave the following words upon the authority, as is related to us by Abdullah ibn Salam. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, Afshis salam, وَاطْعَمُوا طَعَامٍ وَصِلُوا أَرْحَامٍ وَقُومُوا فِي اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّاسُ نِيَامٍ تَدْخُلُوا الْجَنَّةِ بِالسَّلَامٍ. Very famous hadith, in which the Prophet ﷺ said, spread peace, afshis salam, spread peace amongst yourselves. وَاطْعَمُوا طَعَامٍ, and feed people food. Spread peace and feed people food. وَصِلُوا أَرْحَامٍ, and maintain the ties of kinship, your blood relationships. وَقُومُوا فِي اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّاسُ نِيَامٍ, pray at night when the people are sleeping. تَدْخُلُوا الْجَنَّةِ بِسَلَامٍ, and you will enter paradise with peace. Now, one of the interesting aspects, and there's many interests, we can do a whole khutbah actually just about this particular khutbah. But I want everyone to think about not just when he was giving this khutbah, because it was the very first khutbah given in Medina, but to whom he was giving the khutbah. Because his community at that time was very diverse. You have immigrant Muslims that came from Mecca and found themselves in a new community, in a new land, where they didn't know the language or parts of the language, they didn't understand the culture, they didn't understand the roads and the systems and the behaviors and all of that. And yet, he was also addressing the indigenous Muslims, the Muslims that had grown up there. They had grown up in Yathrib. They knew the streets, they knew the culture, they knew the people, they knew the lineage, they knew all of these things. But they were perhaps maybe a little bit newer in Islam. And so in this dichotomy, the Prophet ﷺ is building a community with his very first khutbah. That's what he was doing. We don't tend to think about it like that, but that's exactly what he was doing. He's saying, number one, your community's got to be built on peace. You've got to spread salam to one another. Say salamu alaikum to people you don't know. That's what you're going to do, number one. Then he says, feed people food. Go out there, mingle. Invite people into your home. Feed them food. Find out who's needy. Find out who's hungry and bring them into your home. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in the khutbah. The ikram al-dayf, what that means. And then number 3, he says, maintain your ties of kinship. Now I found this fascinating because half of the crowd, if not more, were people from Mecca that had just left their kinship behind. They literally were driven out by their kinship, by people that they loved, that because of La ilaha illallah were told, no, get out of here. And he's talking to those people, and he's saying, don't forget about them. Maintain your ties of kinship. Make sure you're still maintaining those blood relationships. Building a community, brothers and sisters, doesn't happen automatically. And of course, underpinning all of that, قُومُوا فِي اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّاسُ نِيَامٌ. Pray at night when people are sleeping. Don't forget your vertical relationship to Allah. You have a horizontal relationship to people, but your vertical relationship with Allah needs to be in sync. And the reward of doing that is تَدْخُلُ الْجَنَّةِ بِسَلَامٍ. You will enter paradise. You do these things, you will enter paradise with peace. What I found very interesting about this, brothers and sisters, is if you look at the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he was purposefully addressing different and all aspects of his community. In this khutbah I mentioned to you, he's talking about both immigrant Muslims and indigenous Muslims. Very similar to the communities that we have all around America today. People that were born in Islam and people that grew up in other parts and came to this land. Right? That's part of it. But he also was able to address the elderly and the youth. Throughout his tenure as prophet, he was very keen on making sure that there were relationships that were transgenerational. One of the greatest contributions of Muslim society is the continuity of knowledge and adab that is passed down generation to generation. We don't tend to think about that. We don't. But it is very few religious traditions have survived for over 1,000 years without any changes to the core belief. Let me repeat that. Very few religious traditions have survived for thousands of years without any changes to the core beliefs. And yet that's exactly what Karen Armstrong mentions about Islam. He said, by and large, they had some political differences, yes. But the core belief structures, if there was a Muslim over time that said, hey, there's actually 6 prayers instead of 5, they were rejected. They were rejected because the core beliefs didn't change. That does not happen by accident. That is a deliberate transfer of transgenerational knowledge and adab. Practice. What Karen Armstrong mentions is not just orthodoxy, but orthopraxy. How Muslims practice their religion. And this, brothers and sisters, is a key cornerstone for what was, prior to the modern age, many Muslim societies. You could see Muslim societies that had carried on traditions that were hundreds of years old. Hundreds of years old. Maybe even 1,000 years old. Simply because they were part of that culture. I shared with some of you all many years ago that I was... When I had come back from southern Spain, I had visited Muslim communities in southern Spain a few years ago. And I remember speaking to one of the converts. His father had converted to Islam in the 1970s. And he himself was a child that grew up in Spain, in southern Spain, outside in an area called Orhiva. And he said, you know what was really interesting to me was when I learned wudu. Because wudu was actually how we grew up washing ourselves as non-Muslims. Washing with our hands, going all the way up here, rinsing your mouth out with water, kind of washing your hair. He's like, we just did this as part of our culture, not knowing that came from Islam. It wasn't until I became Muslim and I learned wudu that I said, wait a minute, that's what we do over there in the mountains, in Orhiva. in Spain. That's how we wash ourselves. How is that? But again, he came from a non-Muslim family. Understanding this is how tradition was passed on transgenerationally. The Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he made it a point, brothers and sisters, to include not just the elderly, or I shouldn't say the elderly, but the kind of the older members of society, as well as the youth as part of his community. We have so many examples of this. He made people feel at home. I'll share with you just one. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, who grew up in the house of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, was one of the first people who took his family to Abyssinia. And what many people don't realize is that when he took his family to Abyssinia in that first immigration in Mecca, the situation for Muslims was very difficult. Very difficult. He did not return back into the Prophet's home until 15 years later, after the Prophet had already established himself in Medina. So for those 15 years, he lived in Abyssinia under a Christian king or Christian administration. And he himself, his own children grew up Abyssinian. Now when he comes to Medina, those same children speak Arabic in a language or with an accent that is Abyssinian. Because they didn't grow up in Arabia, they didn't grow up in Medina or Mecca. So their Arabic was borrowed, if you will, with that Abyssinian accent. Just to make them feel at home, the Prophet ﷺ, he started responding to their Arabic in the same accent. Just to make children feel like they were welcome in his majlis, alayhi salatu wassalam. The Prophet ﷺ, at the end of his life, he put a man that was 17 years old, only 17 years old, Usama bin Zayd, at the head of the Muslim army as a general. And this, I find this fascinating. I'm in leadership now at my company. And what's very interesting, or the company I worked for, I should say, is that sometimes you can just tell when a person has leadership traits. You can just tell, you're working with them and you realize this person has leadership in them. And the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't let age dictate who was going to be. He realized Usama bin Zayd can lead people as a general. So what is he going to do? He made him the general of the army, an army that had Sahaba that were much older than he was. But perhaps didn't have the same type of charisma that was needed for that army. And there's many other examples. Just this morning I was studying with Imam Majid, and he was talking about ikram ad-dayf, the generosity that we're supposed to give to our neighbors and our people that come into our homes, not just neighbors, but people that come into our home, our guests. And he said one of the interesting things was that in the books of fiqh, they talk about if a child is older than 10 years old, then they should sit with the adults when their guests are there at their homes. Just think about that for a moment. What happens oftentimes when we have people that come to our homes? Is the adults segregate on one side and then the children go and segregate somewhere else. Is this true or not true? It happens all the time. And yet, in our tradition, there's a sense that, wait, how are the children going to learn the adab of hosting guests if they are not there hosting guests? And so the idea was that even having the children sit with the adults, at least for a period of time, teaches them how to interact with people transgenerationally. People who are older than they are. People who are maybe a few generations older than they are. And this is why in many Muslim societies, even to this day, there is a concept beyond just the nuclear family. You have the supranuclear family, where there are oftentimes parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, all living either within the same home or within a very short proximity of each other. You see, brothers and sisters, in order for us to be honoring others, we have to teach our children how to honor them. In order for us to learn about what's there in culture, we have to be engaging with our children. And this type of symbiotic relationship in communities, this transgenerational transfer of knowledge and of adab, can happen naturally if we promote it as such. About 10 years ago, I had an opportunity to visit the Aida refugee camp in the West Bank. And we were there as part of doing some relief work with them. And I spent 10 days in a refugee camp in Bethlehem. And just to give you guys some prospect or some understanding here, the refugee camp itself borders the wall that the Israeli government has put around kind of pockets of the West Bank. And so literally, we were very close to seeing where the sniper towers and the walls and all that stuff was. Inside the refugee camp, brothers and sisters, we were hosted by different families where everyone came together to host us simply because we came from, quote unquote, the outside world. I mean, I was humbled to see the generosity in people who are living in conditions that you and I would break us. Would break us. And yet in that situation, the amount of generosity, the amount of honor that was given to the guests, I was floored. And children, it was children, middle-aged people, elderly, everybody was involved. Everybody had chores. Everybody was going out of their way to make sure that their guests were honored. Even though their guests, I guarantee you, came from materially much better situations than what they were witnessing on a daily basis in the West Bank, in Bethlehem. You see, brothers and sisters, how important it is for us to make sure that we are actively promoting situations where children, parents, grandchildren, community members are all together learning from one another. And by the way, I'm a parent now as well. There's plenty that my kids are teaching me every day. Not just about parenting, but about society. The society that I grew up with, the high school that I went to down the street, is very different now than what it was when I was there. Important for us to continuously engage to promote engagement between the younger and other generations of our community. I was also very surprised, subhanAllah. I visited the Polynesian Cultural Center many, many years ago, about 15 years ago, in Hawaii. And as we were walking through, I'm not sure how many people know kind of the history of Hawaii and how it was discovered, but Hawaii is the most remote place on earth. It is 2,000 miles from any other landmass in the entire world, at least 2,000 miles away. So the most remote place you can go is Hawaii in terms of proximity to landmass. And we're walking through the Polynesian Cultural Center, and they're telling us about how Hawaii was discovered. And I was floored. There were literally Polynesian peoples from the Polynesian islands that set out on boats. They set out on boats and they went out into the seas. And they tracked how the seas were moving, how the winds were blowing, and where the star locations were. And they wrote it into stories. And then they passed these stories into song form, as songs, to their next generations. And so when they discovered Hawaii, they knew how to get back to their Polynesian islands because of these stories and songs that they had created. And there was an unbroken chain of narrators by which they went, discovered those islands, and came all the way back, and then sent more people out to go discover more. And the whole time I'm listening to this story, I'm thinking, this is how hadith were passed on in our tradition. Unbroken chain of narration. This is not just something that is unique, perhaps. I mean, the idea of hadith, of course, is unique to Islam. But pre-modern cultures had ways in which transgenerational knowledge was transferred. Through their stories, through their songs, through their means of making sure that the next generation was building on top of what the previous generation had done. Not that they were starting over, not that they were starting from scratch. And just understanding those shared histories led to discoveries such as the discovery of Hawaii, the most remote place in the entire world. You see, brothers and sisters, our job as Muslims should be to build upon the generations that preceded before us. Not to tear it down, not to say, you know what, we're in 21st century America, we know better than those previous generations, we know better than what they did. It's to build upon what they have given us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us builders upon that generation. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the best in this world and the next world and protect us from the punishment of the fire. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه غفور. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وبعد. We begin in the name of Allah Azza wa Jal by asking Him to send peace and blessings upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. May his peace and blessings be upon him and his family. Brothers and sisters in Islam, I wanted to end today's khutbah. Just a reminder to all of us, unfortunately, much of modern society today is struggling with communications transgenerationally. In fact, they actually have a word for it called the generation gap. Right? That there's a generation gap between people who lived maybe 50 years ago or grew up coming of age 50 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago or 10 years ago, and coming of age now. We have built-in mechanisms in our tradition to stop that gap from getting bigger, but actually to minimize it. How do we do that? By purposefully engaging with our community members, by purposely bringing our children to the masjid, by purposely using the masjid as a means to bring people together. You know, one of the things that was really surprising for me is that I was asked, I remember this in 4th grade, to put together a family tree for a 4th grade project that we had. And I went directly to my parents, and my father, rahmatullahi alayhi, he knew lineage like nobody I know, right? So he sat down, he said, oh, you want the family tree? I'll give you the family tree. And we sat down, he mapped out an entire, I remember the poster board, to this day in my head, I remember the poster board with the family tree on it. And he's like, how many generations do you want me to go back? And I said, I think the poster board can only hold 2. So let's just go back 2 generations. So his grandfather, right? And keeping it down. Later on in life, he would go on to actually document 25 generations of lineage for his own family, from my family. But what surprised me was when I came to class that day, how many people had no idea who was beyond their grandparents. They had no clue on their family tree, like what was beyond that. And yet in our tradition, we're taught to know lineage. Protection of lineage is actually one of the maqasid of the Sharia, is one of the objectives of the Sharia. And we tend to just take it for granted. But there's a special connection in knowing our heritage and then transferring that heritage to others. Making dua for one another is really important, but sitting down and learning stories. Learning stories. What were the struggles of those previous generations? How did they establish themselves here in America? What are they doing today to remember that in terms of their legacy? That's incredibly important for us. And then for us to do the same with our children and grandchildren, to make sure that there's an unbroken chain of narration that we can build on. This is what this is what the companions and the generations after them did flawlessly. This is why Islam in its form today, even 1400 years after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is still intact as a deen. It's still, there's over 2 billion people, 2.5 billion people in the world that profess to be Muslim. Why? Because we've been able to do this in a way that other traditions get watered down or their core belief systems start to change. We don't have that in our tradition. Let's make it a point, brothers and sisters, to come together with our children, with our grandchildren, transgenerationally, and share stories. Pray together. Make dua for one another. This is going to go a long way in building that community that I talked about in the previous hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us a vibrant community. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the best in this world and the next and protect us from the punishment of the fire. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant all of us forgiveness and forgive all those who have died before us in faith. May He erase from our hearts any ill feelings towards others. Indeed, He is most merciful and forgiving. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us spouses and children that will be the comfort of our eyes and make us leaders of the righteous. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين وجعلنا للمتقين إماما. ربنا اغفر لنا ولوالدينا وللمؤمنين يوم يقوم الحساب. ربنا اغفر لنا ولإخواننا الذين سبقونا بالإيمان ولا تجعل في قلوبنا غلا للذين آمنوا ربنا إنك رؤوف رحيم. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. Brothers and sisters in Islam, anything that I've said that is good, it's from Allah, the source of all that is good. Anything that I've said that is an error is due to my own lack of knowledge. For that, I ask for your forgiveness and ask for the forgiveness of Allah, most merciful, most forgiving. Wa aqimus salah. Let's stand for prayer, inshallah.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
So, Saqim wa rahmakumullah, straighten the lines as best you can. As a reminder, we'll have a few announcements after Salah. We encourage you to remain seated and engage in dhikr until the announcements are over. At that point, you'll be free to be on your way, inshallah ta'ala. So, Allahu Akbar. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. والضحى والليل إذا سجى ما ودعك ربك وما قلى وللآخرة خير لك من الأولى ولسوف يعطيك ربك فترضى ألم يجدك يتيما فآوى ووجدك ضالا فهدى ووجدك عائلا فأغنى فأما اليتيم فلا تكهر وأما السائل فلا تنهر وأما بنعمة ربك فحدث. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين والتين والزيتون وطور سينين وهذا البلد الأمين لقد خلقنا الإنسان في أحسن تقويم ثم رددناه أسفل سافلين إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات فلهم أجر غير ممنون فما يكذبك بعد بالدين أليس الله بأحكم الحاكمين الله أكبر سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر السلام عليكم ورحمة الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Shad, Imam, for leading us into prayer. Just a few announcements before you go on your way. Tomorrow night, Saturday, December 7th, will be the Adams fundraising dinner. You can get more information about that at the front desk. This is for the Leesburg branch. It'll be tomorrow night here at Adams Sterling, starting at 6 p.m. Adams Center does run on your donations. You can donate using your credit card, debit card, cash check, Apple Pay, and Samsung Pay up by the front desk. Kahwa Cafe is open for business, and we do have food sale in the back. All proceeds will be going to the Adams Center. Tonight, Friday, December 6th, we have Sips and Subha with Ustad Kauthar here at Adams Sterling at 6 p.m. Sida of the Prophet with Imam Kiba at our Sully branch at 7 p.m. Family Creating Healthy Dynamics at the Hawa Fairfax Center at 7:45. Journey with the Quran with Sheikh Tijani happening here at Adams Sterling after Isha. And also Adams Leadership's Fireside Chat happening tonight at Adams Sterling with Kahwa after Isha prayer.